The Indigenous peoples of Canada have endured a long history of racism and discrimination. This started with the Indian Act, which forced Indigenous people onto reserves which were much smaller than the land they used to own. They also were required to get Indian status to receive any benefits from the Act. The main goal of this act was to start the assimilation of the Indigenous peoples into Euro-Canadian culture. The next big step for this assimilation was the residential schools.
Indigenous children, as young as 4, were sent to these schools to educate them. The Indigenous families often had no choice but to send their children to the schools, as they had agents that would go after them if they didn't. They were trying to remove any sense of Indigenous culture and assimilate them into Euro-Canadian culture. The estimated 150,000 children that attended these schools suffered daily abuse from the members of the church that ran the school. This abuse included isolating the children from their family, both at school and outside of it, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and extremely poor living conditions.
They were deprived of basic human rights that we have at school today. These poor living conditions caused disease to spread easily around the schools. An estimated 6,000 Indigenous children died in these residential schools, either from abuse or disease. Just recently, 217 unmarked graves were found near the residential school in Kamloops. This started a period of reckoning, where investigations were conducted at other residential school sites, resulting in a total 1,504 graves being discovered at the 7 sites. The ones that did survive spent the rest of their lives with immense trauma that has gone through generations.
Intergenerational trauma is spread from being passed down through the youth. As the Canadian government supported the violent assimilation of Indigenous people and their culture, students would come back to their families with a lack of understanding of their culture and knowledge of the world, failing to cope and look after themselves. With a lack of a nurturing and caring environment, new parents would be unfamiliar with children and later push them towards coping mechanisms like substance abuse. Such acts paint a negative image on Indigenous people, which are a result of the government's negligence and carelessness.
The unfair treatment continues to this day. Indigenous people and communities in northern regions are ignored by the Canadian government, leading to unclean water on reserves, inflated costs of living, and a lack of social services. There has also been a significant amount of cases with missing and murdered Indigenous women across BC, whose cases have been ignored. The issues have been in the news, yet the government does not take steady action. Such conditions are leading to dangerous conditions for the elderly and young children, damaging their growth and overall health. Their situation only gets worse, with the higher cost of living as families are having trouble staying fed and healthy every day, as everyday items and bills are heavily priced and lack any word or action from the government. With difficult access to quality services and the lower mainland of Canada, families are stuck up north with limited chances at a better life.
Indigenous communities across Canada are suffering today from the treatment their ancestors faced, and such treatment carries on to this day. The abuse, pain, and suffering felt in the past are passed down through generations, and young children are facing the consequences today. As Canadians, it's our responsibility to educate ourselves on our own history and recognize the misinformation and unfair treatment which Indigenous people have and still are experiencing to this moment. The National Day of Truth and Reconciliation is coming up, and some things you can do to help is wear an orange shirt to show your support, donate to Indigenous foundations, and overall teach yourself and others about the horrors the Indigenous people have been forced to endure.